Welcome back to the deep dive. This time around, we're tackling startups and entrepreneurship, and one book that seems to be everywhere is The Lean Startup. It's fascinating to see it referenced by everyone from, Fortune 500 CEOs to like professors at Harvard, and then you've also got those scrappy, tech founders.
It really does highlight how this idea sort of goes beyond, the typical image we have of startups. Ries is really arguing that this is a framework that can apply to any organization, no matter the size, wrestling with uncertainty in any sector.
Okay, that's interesting. I initially pictured it being all about those, Silicon Valley guys
Yeah.
coding in their garages. But Rees actually talks about how even big established companies like Intuit, the company behind TurboTax, are using these principles to stay ahead of the game.
Intuit's story is a great illustration of how even a large organization can sort of revitalize itself by embracing this experimental mindset. They went from infrequent, massive product launches to testing, a bunch of changes every week during tax season, refining and adapting based on what they learn from users.
Wow, that's pretty radical. It reminds me of that build, measure, learn loop from the book. It's almost like you're sailing into uncharted territory and constantly having to adjust your course based on what you discover.
Exactly. Remries uses this analogy of a startup's engine of growth being like, when Henry Ford was tinkering with his first cars trying to get the most out of them?
Right, so it's not just about building a great product, it's about making sure it's a product that actually meets a real need in the market.
Exactly. And that's where the concept of a minimum viable product, or MVP, comes in. Rimas gives examples like, how Zappos started as just an online shoe showcase or Dropbox with that early explainer video? It's all about testing your assumptions with the most basic version of the product, gathering feedback, and then iterating based on that.
Okay, so ditch the meticulously crafted business plan and just get out there and experiment. Makes sense to me. But how do you know if you're on the right track? I mean, how do you make sense of all the data?
Well, that's where the idea of validated learning comes in. It's about focusing on metrics that actually demonstrate real progress towards your goals, not just vanity metrics that make you look good, but don't translate into real value.
Right, substance over style. I remember reading about how IMVU, the company Ries co-founded, had this seemingly brilliant idea for,
Yeah.
an avatar-based instant messaging add-on. But they were so focused on the technical aspects that they missed a key insight. Users didn't want another add-on. They wanted a standalone platform where they could connect with new people.
IMVU's experience really shows how crucial it is to sometimes make a substantial shift in direction, what Rees calls a pivot, to truly align your product with what the market actually wants.
That reminds me of Vodafone, another company featured in the book. They started as a social network for civic engagement, but after several pivots, they ended up as a paid platform that connects activists with voters.
Vodafone's journey is a perfect example of how pivoting isn't about failure. It's about strategically adapting based on evidence and customer feedback to effectively achieve your vision.
So it seems like speed and agility are really key in the lean startup. But how do these principles apply to companies that aren't making software? You can't exactly release a new car design every day.
Well, that's where the idea of small batches comes in. Rees draws inspiration from lean manufacturing, showing how even in software development, you can break your work down into these smaller, faster cycles, kind of like Toyota's famous production system. He even points to a company called SGW Design Works that used this approach to rapidly design and manufacture medical devices.
Right, they were creating physical prototypes in just days, using 3D modeling and customer feedback to quickly iterate. It's amazing how this small batch approach can speed up learning and reduce waste, even in industries where things traditionally take a long time.
Hmm.
But how do you keep things organized as you scale? I mean, not everyone can be constantly tinkering with the product, right?
That's where the idea of an adaptive organization comes in. Rees stresses the importance of building a culture that encourages experimentation, where teams are empowered to make decisions and where failure is seen as a learning opportunity, not a disaster.
The analogy of an innovation sandbox really resonated with me. It's about having this safe space within a company where teams can experiment freely without being bogged down by the usual corporate layers.
That innovation sandbox really encapsulates the idea that entrepreneurship doesn't just belong to startups. It can thrive anywhere where there's this culture of learning and adaptation.
So how do you actually put this into practice? Is there a specific framework for making decisions and tracking progress in this constantly changing world of experimentation?
Mm.
And that leads us to the concept of innovation accounting. I mean, Ries argues that, traditional accounting methods don't really cut it for startups. You need a system that's focused on measuring progress towards validated learning, not just, hitting arbitrary milestones.
That's where things get really intriguing. Traditional financial statements tell a story of the past, but innovation accounting is about helping us write the story of the future. It's about understanding those leading indicators of success, not just, the lagging ones.
Grocket, the online test prep company, comes to mind. They were initially tracking their progress using vanity metrics like total users and, questions answered, which gave them this false sense of accomplishment. It wasn't until they started measuring things like customer engagement and retention that they realized their product wasn't as engaging as they thought.
Grokkett's story really highlights how focusing on the right metrics can be uncomfortable, but it's absolutely essential for uncovering, the true reality of your venture. They eventually started using split testing and cohort analysis to get a deeper understanding of their customer behavior, which led to a successful pivot.
So it seems like the lean startup is really about this continuous process of iteration and learning. But how do you know when it's time for a major change, like a pivot, versus just continuing to refine your existing product?
It's a dilemma every entrepreneur faces, and Ries doesn't offer a magic formula, but he does outline a framework for navigating these tough decisions.
Right? He talks about clearly articulating your leap of faith assumptions up front, measuring your progress against those assumptions, and being willing to pivot when the evidence suggests you need to change course. It's kind of like that saying, if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging.
Exactly. The lean startup methodology is all about recognizing when you're on the wrong path and having the courage to change direction even when it's uncomfortable. It's about actively steering the vehicle, not just building a more powerful engine.
This has been a really insightful look at the lean startup and this whole idea of building organizations under conditions of uncertainty. I'm starting to see how these principles can be applied way beyond just tech startups.
It's a powerful framework for anyone who's trying to bring new ideas to life, whether it's a new product, a social venture, or even an internal initiative within a large company.
Before we move on to that 10-point summary you mentioned, I want to touch on a really interesting concept from the epilogue. The long-term stock exchange, Ries, argues that our current stock market forces companies to focus on short-term gains, which often prevents them from investing in long-term innovation. He proposes creating a new stock exchange that would be specifically designed for companies that are committed to sustainable growth and long-term thinking. What are your thoughts on that?
It's definitely a thought-provoking idea. It makes you wonder what kind of world we could create if we had a system that rewarded businesses for focusing on long-term value creation instead of just the next quarter's earnings report.
Imagine a world where companies were more willing to take risks, invest in groundbreaking research, and build products that truly benefit society in the long run.
It's an inspiring vision for sure.
It really is. All right, I'm excited to hear your concise breakdown of the key principles from our deep dive. You always have a knack for distilling information so elegantly.
Well, let's see if I can live up to those expectations. Here's my attempt to capture the essence of the lean startup in 10 key takeaways. First, entrepreneurship goes beyond those, Silicon Valley startups. It's a mindset that can be applied to building any organization under conditions of extreme uncertainty, regardless of size or industry.
So it's not about the ping pong tables or the kombucha on tap. It's about embracing uncertainty and having a framework for navigating the unknown.
Exactly. And that leads us to our second takeaway. A startup's true progress is measured by validated learning, not just lines of code or product features. It's about proving your hypotheses through real-world experiments and data, constantly testing those assumptions you have about customer needs and business viability.
So it's not about building the perfect product in a vacuum.
Yeah.
It's about getting it in front of customers as early as possible, even if it's just a bare bones version.
Precisely. Which brings us to the third takeaway, the build, measure, learn feedback loop. This encourages constant iteration and adaptation based on what you hear from your customers, rather than sticking rigidly to your initial plan.
It's like having an ongoing conversation with the market, adjusting your approach based on what you're learning.
Absolutely. And to facilitate that conversation, you need to identify your key leap of faith assumptions, those make or break beliefs about your business, and then rigorously test them. That's the fourth takeaway.
And the best way to test those assumptions, the minimum viable product, or MVP, right?
You got it. The fifth takeaway is all about the MVP. Launching the simplest version of your product that allows you to gather meaningful data and validate or invalidate your assumptions.
We've seen some great examples of that, like Zappos and Dropbox, testing the waters with their early streamlined offerings.
Exactly. But it's crucial to focus on the right data. That brings us to takeaway number 6. Avoid getting seduced by those vanity metrics.
Right, those superficial numbers that might look impressive, but don't actually reflect real customer engagement or progress towards your goals.
Precisely. Instead, you want to focus on actionable data that directly reflects customer behavior and can inform your decision making.
So constantly asking yourself, what does this metric tell me about my core assumptions?
Exactly. And sometimes those metrics will tell you that it's time for a major course correction, a pivot. That's takeaway number 7.
We've seen some compelling examples of companies like Vodafone and Wealthfront making significant pivots based on what they learned from their experiments and customer interactions.
Pivoting isn't about admitting defeat. It's about having the flexibility to adapt your strategy while staying true to your overall vision.
It's like changing lanes on the highway. You're still heading towards your destination, but you've adjusted your route based on the current traffic conditions.
A perfect analogy. But pivoting isn't always easy. It requires a culture that embraces experimentation and sees failure as an opportunity to learn.
Which brings us to the 8th takeaway, building an adaptive organization.
Exactly. It's about creating an environment where teams are empowered to make decisions, where continuous learning is valued, and where failure is seen as a stepping stone to success.
And remember that innovation sandbox concept. It's about creating a space within an organization where teams can experiment more freely without being bogged down by bureaucracy.
Such a great concept. Now, to sustain this culture of experimentation, you need a system for measuring progress and making decisions in this world of constant change. That's where innovation accounting comes in, our 9th takeaway.
Right. It's about moving beyond traditional accounting methods and focusing on metrics that track validated learning, not just hitting arbitrary milestones or shipping features.
Exactly. And that brings us to our final takeaway, managing a portfolio of activities.
So balancing the need to optimize your existing products and business models with the need to explore new growth opportunities.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that even the most successful products eventually reach maturity, and you need a constant influx of fresh ideas and experiments to sustain growth. This might involve setting up innovation sandboxes, empowering teams to explore new markets, or even acquiring promising startups to fuel the company's innovation engine.
It's like tending a garden. You need to nurture your existing plants while also planting new seeds for future growth. Otherwise, your garden will eventually wither and fade.
A beautiful analogy. It perfectly captures the essence of managing a portfolio of innovation activities.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I
Yeah.
feel like I've been given a whole new toolkit for approaching innovation, whether it's in my own personal projects or within a larger organization.
I'm so glad to hear that. And remember, the lean startup methodology isn't just a set of rigid rules. It's a mindset and a framework for navigating the uncertain terrain of bringing new ideas to life.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to that fascinating concept from the lean startup. That idea of a long-term stock exchange rise argues that our current stock market pressures companies to prioritize short-term gains, often at the expense of long-term innovation. He proposes creating a new stock exchange that would be specifically designed for companies that are committed to sustainable growth and long-term thinking.
It's a provocative idea, isn't it? It makes you wonder what kind of world we could create if we had a system that rewarded businesses for focusing on long-term value creation instead of just the next quarter's earnings report.
I can imagine a world where companies were more willing to take risks, invest in groundbreaking research, and develop products that truly benefit society in the long run.
It's an inspiring vision, for sure.
It really is. Okay, that's a thought-provoking concept to ponder. I'm feeling inspired to think more deeply about how we can build a world that supports and rewards long-term thinking.
That's the beauty of these deep dives. They spark our curiosity, challenge our assumptions, and leave us with a thirst for further exploration.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think it's time for our final thought.
Yes, let's leave our listener with something to contemplate. We've discussed the importance of validated learning and the need to test our assumptions in the real world. But what about our personal assumptions? Those deeply held beliefs about ourselves, our capabilities, and our place in the world. How often do we challenge those assumptions? How often do we put them to the test?
That's such a powerful question. It challenges us to apply the principles of the lean startup, not just to our businesses or projects, but to our own lives.
It invites us to see our personal journeys as ongoing experiments, to embrace uncertainty, and to constantly seek out new experiences and perspectives that can challenge our assumptions and foster growth.
Wow, that's a really thought-provoking way to end our deep dive. I'm definitely going to be reflecting on that as I embark on my next adventure, whatever that may be.
And I'm sure you'll approach that adventure with a renewed sense of curiosity, agility, and a willingness to embrace the inevitable twists and turns along the way.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, happy learning.
And happy experimenting.
Now, before we send you off to build your own entrepreneurial empires, how about we recap those key takeaways in a nice, concise 10-point summary?
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Okay, point number one, entrepreneurship. It's not just about Silicon Valley or building the next killer app. It's a mindset you can use to build anything under conditions of uncertainty, regardless of the industry or size of the company.
Exactly. It's about navigating the unknown, not just chasing the next big tech trend.
Point number two, forget about those vanity metrics. Real progress is measured by validated learning. It's about testing your assumptions with real-world experiments and data, not just racking up impressive-sounding numbers.
Think of it like this. What truly matters is separating the signal from the noise.
Point number three, embrace the build, measure, learn feedback loop. Don't be afraid to change course based on what you discover along the way.
Right. It's about staying flexible and adapting to new information as you go.
Point number four, identify those make-or-break beliefs about your business, those leap-of-faith assumptions. And once you've identified them, test them rigorously.
Don't shy away from those tough questions. Get out there and gather the evidence you need.
Point number five, build a minimum viable product, MVP. It's the simplest version of your product that allows you to test your assumptions and gather real data.
Remember, it's not about perfection at this stage. It's about getting something out there quickly and learning from how the market responds.
Point number six, sometimes you need to make a major shift, a pivot. It's not about admitting defeat, but about being willing to adapt your strategy based on what you've learned.
Think of it as adjusting your course based on the landscape you're navigating.
Point number seven, foster what Ries calls an adaptive organization, a company culture that embraces experimentation, empowers teams to make decisions, and sees failure as an opportunity to learn and grow.
It's about creating an environment where people feel safe to take risks and learn from their mistakes.
Point number eight, create innovation sandboxes, those protected spaces where teams can experiment freely without being bogged down by bureaucracy.
Give people the space and freedom they need to explore new ideas and try new things.
Point number nine, adopt innovation accounting. It's a system for measuring progress that focuses on validated learning, not just hitting arbitrary milestones or deadlines.
Traditional accounting methods aren't always the best way to measure innovation. You need a system that tracks the metrics that really matter.
And finally, point number 10, manage a portfolio of activities. Balance the need to optimize your existing products with the exploration of new growth opportunities.
It's like having a garden. You need to take care of the plants you have while also planting new seeds for future growth.
That was a fantastic summary. I feel like I've got a whole new set of tools for tackling innovation, whether it's in my own projects or at work.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, the lean startup isn't just a set of rules to follow. It's a way of thinking and a framework for navigating the uncertain world of bringing new ideas to life.
Absolutely. Well, before we sign off for today, any final thoughts for our listeners out there?
I'd encourage everyone to think about their own personal assumptions. We've talked about testing business assumptions, but what about those deeply held beliefs we have about ourselves, our capabilities, our place in the world? How often do we question those assumptions? How often do we put them to the test?
That's a really powerful question. It reminds us that the principles of the lean startup aren't just for businesses. They can be applied to our own lives as well.
Embrace uncertainty, experiment, and never stop learning. That's the heart of entrepreneurship, both in business and in life.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, happy learning and happy experimenting.